All right, guys. So we're going to finish up our discussion about the American Revolution battle campaigns, and just to refresh a little bit on what we talked about before. Our question is, how was America able to win the war? And we focused on the New England campaign and all the battles that took place in New England. If you recall, the British battle strategy was try to isolate New England, kind of working along this imaginary line, kind of like from New York north, and then also focusing on the capital in Philadelphia. So we talked about the battles in Boston, which the British won, Long Island in New York, and Washington's unsuccessful defense of New York City. And then the loss at Fort Ticonderoga. And then as the campaign turned south towards Philadelphia, losses at Brandywine and Germantown. But then later on, Christmas Eve crossing, Washington comes up with a surprise victory at Trenton, which kind of holds his army together. And then another surprise victory at Princeton to kind of keep the Continental Army together. So by the end of 1777, going into 1778, it didn't look very good for the Continental Army until they got a victory at Saratoga to push back the British the British advance towards Albany and eventually New York City. And that victory, as we said before, was important because it would eventually convince the French to join the Americans and be their ally. So that victory at Saratoga here is important from that strategic standpoint. So that's where we left off. So I'm going to pick up now, kind of talk about America's relationship with France. And, one of the challenges that the United States faced was that it was certainly short on supplies and money and troops. And so early on in the war, even as soon as the Declaration of Independence was written, Continental Congress sent out diplomats to different countries in Europe who might be potential enemies of Great Britain to try to convince them that they should aid the American cause and fight against the British. And of course, France was a likely target because, as we know, Great Britain and France fought several wars over North America. And recently, in terms of our study in 1763, France lost the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, to Great Britain, and had to give up a bunch of its North American colonies. And that really hurt the French Empire and the French economy. And so the United States looked to them as a potential partner in this war against Great Britain to want to get revenge. So they sent this man, Silas Deane. He was the original diplomat to France. Deane was a merchant and a politician from the United States, and he spent a lot of time in France. When he first got there, he did a good job. He was very savvy. He was a great politician. Made some great relationships with the French, but he also worked with a lot of secret agents and spies in Great Britain as well. And early on in the war, in the American War, for the American side, Deane was able to organize arms shipments and some money, but he wasn't able to outright convince the French to sign an alliance and a treaty and recognize the United States as a separate country. And that was important for the United States to gain recognition around the world. That's how you really viewed it as a real country, as a serious country. And an alliance with France would mean that the United States would get access to France's army, its navy, and of course its wealth, which France still had some of at this point. Silas Deane was also very good at recruiting French volunteers to come fight in the American cause. Most of them were enlightened aristocrats. They were people who were of wealth, that were trained in the French military and were looking for some sort of glory to make a name for themselves. So a lot of them weren't, your rank and file sort of infantrymen that the United States really needed, but he did succeed in convincing quite a few French officers and Frenchmen to join the cause and come recruit them and fight the American Revolution. Deane, because Deane wasn't totally successful, eventually the United States would send over more ambassadors. But Silas Deane himself is a really interesting story. Just kind of a side tangent. Deane was he was in France for a while, and then eventually when the other diplomats came over, he was still there. But he worked a lot of double agents in Great Britain, and he kind of made himself to seem as he was a supporter of the British. But anyway, long story short, Silas Deane's death is a very mysterious sort of chain of events. He got ill right before he was about to come back to the United States in the 1780s, and then he mysteriously died on the ship before he got there. And there are some historians that think that he perhaps was poisoned by one of the double agents that he was working with in Great Britain. But anyway, kind of an interesting side story if you want to learn more about Silas Deane. He's an interesting read. So anyway, he was our first diplomat, and he was sort of successful, but never really got that treaty that the United States was looking for in that aid. And that treaty comes when Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson end up going to France. So Jefferson and Franklin, after the victory at Saratoga, go over to France, and they would end up spending 9 years there as ambassadors to the French. And Benjamin Franklin was a rock star to the French. They loved him. They read a lot of things that he wrote. That his story was well known around the world of a kind of a self-made man, a very intelligent man, and he was very charismatic. And he fit in very well with French aristocracy and the French upper class and the educated in France. So they liked him. And so Franklin, and so did Jefferson. Jefferson did as well. Even though Jefferson was quite a bit younger, he wasn't as well known. Of course, by this time he's known for being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. But it's really Franklin, with his experience, his wisdom, his reputation, that is able to get France to kind of sign on and support the United States. And the victory at Saratoga was a key point in that. So the French had been waiting all along for a moment to say, yes, we believe that the United States can actually win this war against Great Britain. King Louis the 15th was looking to King Louis XVI was looking to avenge some losses of his grandfather in the French and Indian War and some of the other wars that France had lost. And so he was kind of looking to make a name for himself, the King of France that is, with his own people and get back at his mortal enemy, Great Britain. And Franklin kind of knew this, and he was able to work the king and his ambassadors and his ministers very well. And after the Battle of Saratoga, it kind of gave them the push they needed to say, yes, you know what, we want to support you. We're going to ally ourselves with you. We're going to give you $2 million, promise you 10,000 troops, give you a navy, and provide for military training. And declare war, essentially, on Great Britain, and most importantly, recognize the United States as a nation. So now the United States is an official country with an ally fighting in this war. And then when France came on and allied itself, then not long after that, so did several other European nations, including Spain, which was another important ally because they had a lot of colonies in North America as well. And of course, they're a powerful European nation. So Franklin the ambassador ends up getting the Franco-American Treaty signed in the end of 1777 and 1778, and that's an important turning point for the United States to get this alliance. And that kind of coincides with another important turning point for the United States. So now you have the support of the French. The United States is starting to get this influx of money, and the French troops are organizing themselves to come over. But while the United States was waiting for France, they still were in the midst of this war. And at the end of 1777 and into 1778, as we noted before, the war had not been going well. So this French alliance and this victory at Saratoga are a big deal. But if you really look at the situation, Philadelphia had fallen to the British. So Philadelphia was occupied by the British. New York was occupied by the British. Boston was occupied by the British. And, in the winter of 1777, Washington had won that battle at Trenton, and then later on the battle up here in Princeton. But in reality, things were not going their way. So in the winter of 1777, 1778, in order to kind of protect some key strategic points from the British, that being most importantly Reading and then Lancaster and York, where the new capital of the United States was, Washington camped his army at Valley Forge. Now, if we look at the map here, it is a strategic point. It's a point along the Schuylkill River. So that was a major, thoroughway for the trade of goods. So Washington could use that and protect that trade of goods in western Pennsylvania. If the British were going to march on the capital, Washington would be able to move and defend it from this direction. And if the British were going to march on Reading, where there was an important forge, where there's an important weapons manufacturing center, Washington would be able to defend it from that point. There are also a lot of wealthy people in the area that Washington could go to try to get money and food and kind of beg for assistance. And the ground itself was very defensible. Now, we don't live too far from Valley Forge, and I'm sure you've been there before, but the fact that part of the park backs up against the Schuylkill River, that was a defensible point. You're not going to cross that river and surprise anybody, unless you're Washington in the middle of the night, right? And there's a variety of hills, and there's it's, as the military calls it, good ground. It's very defensible ground that if the British were to attack, the United States would have the upper hand. It also, again, allowed Washington and his network of spies in the area to keep an eye on what the British were doing in Philadelphia with their forces there. So it was a good spot in terms of location for Washington, even though we know in the long run it ended up being a very difficult camp. We read about it in Building an Army, that camping in Valley Forge, it was a tough time for the soldiers, although, as I'll get to in a moment, Washington kind of exaggerated it a little bit for a variety of reasons. So at Valley Forge, this was a critical moment in the war, as I said before. The United States had just gotten the aid of France. They just won an important victory in Saratoga, but the war still wasn't going their way. And the army itself was falling apart, as we read in the article. So at Valley Forge, the United States military got some assistance from a very controversial figure in American history, and that's Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand Baron von Steuben. Yes, that's all his own name. We're just going to call him Baron von Steuben. Baron von Steuben was a Prussian soldier who was a former drill sergeant in the Prussian army. Now, the Prussian army was well known around the world as being one of the best, well-trained fighting forces in the world. You didn't want to go up against the Prussians because they didn't lose a lot of battles. And one of the things that made the Prussians very good was their attention to detail and their commitment to drilling and practicing warfare. So someone who was a drill sergeant, as von Steuben was, they were someone who was very dedicated to the practice of military skill. And so when he came to look at our soldiers at Valley Forge, it was his idea to kind of take the American military and transform it into more of a Prussian type military style. And he told Washington, after observing for several weeks at Valley Forge, he noticed that soldiers were kind of sitting around. They had duties, but they weren't practicing the skill of the soldier. They weren't practicing, firing their weapon. They weren't practicing marching. They weren't practicing military maneuvers. And he said, how do you expect to be a professional army and get any better if you don't practice it? So Washington told him, he's like, you know what, fine. If you want to train the military, I'm going to give you the authority to do so, and come up with a plan, share it with me, and tell me how you're going to train my army, and I'll give you the okay to do so. And that's exactly what von Steuben did. And in our next part of this lecture, I'll explain exactly how he did that and why exactly this was so critical.